Welcome everybody to today's local government education program provided by University of Illinois Extension. My name is Mike Delaney and I'm a community and economic development educator based in Ogle County here in the Northern State Line region. Today's webinar, as you know, will address federal legislative updates for 2022. Begin with a quick housekeeping note. As always, you're welcome at any time to write questions you might have into the Zoom chat space by clicking on the chat icon at the lower center of the Zoom screen. We'll review the questions in a Q&A period following the presentation. I'll remind you that if you're having problems connecting to the webinar, please identify those via chat if you can, and someone will try to assist you. Finally, please remember that after the conclusion of today's presentation, participants will receive an email with slides and a link to the recording of the webinar. If you did not register for the webinar, please put your email in the chat and that'll let us know that you'd like to receive the materials and we'll make sure you get on the distribution list. We're happy to welcome back Erin Hurley from the National Association of Counties. Erin serves as NACo's Deputy Director of Government Affairs and is based in Washington, D.C. Erin works with county officials across the nation to set NACo's policies on matters pertaining to the financial resources of counties, fiscal management, federal assistance, municipal borrowing, county revenues, federal budget, federal tax reform, elections, and Native American issues. That's a lot on her plate. Over the last year, she's specialized in monitoring the implementation of the CARES Act Corona Relief Fund and the American Rescue Plan Act's Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund at the local level. So Erin, without further ado, the podium, so to speak, is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction. And thank you to you and Nancy and the Illinois Connection for inviting me to speak to the group today. So how this presentation will go is that first I will discuss some of the issues that NACo is tracking over the next several months into 2022. I will do a review of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then also talk through the U.S. Department of Treasury's final rule for the American Rescue Plan State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. So in terms of some kind of pressing items right now and over the next month. So first and foremost is that Congress is tasked with finding a solution for when government funding is currently set to expire on February 18th. So just in a little less than a month now. So you may remember at the end of the year, at the end of 2021, the federal government did have an agreement where they just simply passed a short-term stopgap continuing resolution, which just provides level funding for all of the federal agencies and programs through February 18th. So in terms of some more recent developments on where they are, they've kind of gone back and forth in terms of, do they just want to do another short-term continuing resolution, or is it realistic or likely for them to pass a larger omnibus spending package? So last week, House and Senate appropriators, they met ultimately to try and resolve issues that have really kind of stalled the appropriations process right now. This is kind of some of those provisions that have kind of stalled the negotiation process were those that were included in the Build Back Better Act. So for example, some tax provisions around the state and local tax deduction. There have been a lot of back and forth around the child tax credit and several others. So in terms of provisions that will be affected if the continuing resolution is not extended, or if a larger appropriations package is not passed, is that funding for the payment in lieu of taxes or PILT program and the Secure Rural Schools SRS program. So funding would ultimately end, again, because that funding is currently operating under that short-term spending bill. What another priority that NACo is working on to get attached to either the continuing resolution or the larger spending package is additional flexibility for the American Rescue Plan's fiscal recovery funds, the state and local fiscal recovery fund, which I'll go into detail in just a second. And then right now, in regards to the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, So it was reauthorized under the continuing resolution. So the reauthorization of NFIP would end February 18th. So what NACo is trying to do is not only have it be have NFIP have a short-term reauthorization, but we really are working with Congress to have a long-term solution for NFIP. It's been operating under short-term reauthorizations for years now. So NACo was able to work with members of Congress in the House to introduce a bipartisan bill. And so we will be pushing for the inclusion in that in whatever appropriations package. And then of course, in the background as well too is Farm Bill reauthorization. So that also is coming down the pipeline and will be a priority for us this year as well. So in regards to the ARP flexibility legislation that I mentioned, so this bill on the screen is a huge priority for NACo. The name is very long, the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Fiscal Recovery, Infrastructure, and Disaster Relief Flexibility Act, which we just call HR 5735 because that is a mouthful. But background on this bill is that back in October, the Senate passed this bill with unanimous consent, which of course is fairly irregular during these times. So what NACo did was after the Senate passed the bill, we worked with a bipartisan group of House members to introduce companion legislation. And ultimately what it would do is that there were a number of key provisions that if enacted, it would provide additional flexibility in terms of how counties can invest their American Rescue Plan, state and local fiscal recovery funds. One of the top very key provisions that was included was that it would allow counties to use up to $10 million in recovery funds, pretty much just say that they are lost revenue, and then therefore they could be used on any sort of government service. The Treasury rule, the final rule that came out just the other week, actually took this provision straight from this bill. And so now you actually can do that in the Treasury final rule, which is a huge win for counties, huge win for NACo, something that we push for very hard. But while that provision was included in the final rule, there are other key provisions that still remain that are notable to counties that we are continuing to push for. So for example, under HR 5735, counties would be able to allocate up to $10 million or 30%, whichever is greater, for transportation and infrastructure projects. The same goes for the 10 million or 30% for community development block grant programs. And then as well using the funds for disaster relief and addressing any sort of negative economic impacts from natural disasters. So still a very key priority for us. Election reform, that is also has been in a lot of media, a lot of negotiations over the last week and a half. I'm sure folks have seen the coverage on that. So where we are right now is that last week, what the House did is that they took the Freedom to Vote Act, which has been revised several times over the last, I would say maybe 8 months at this point, the Freedom to Vote Act, and then the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which have both passed the House, have not passed the Senate. What the House did was that they actually combined them into a single bill and passed that as the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. So it was attached to a different bill and then was sent over to the Senate for consideration. We know that this week, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did want to bring the legislation to the floor for a vote. However, there are a lot of obstacles that the Senate would have to go through for it to actually be passed. Namely, right now, what the Senate is doing is negotiating Senate rules around the filibuster. So what that means is that to pass this bill, if you amended Senate rules, is that you would not need 60 votes to pass the bill. You need a simple majority, so 51. And so there's been a lot of back and forth around senators, namely Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema, saying they are not in favor of changing the Senate filibuster rules. So that has stalled the kind of process for passing this election reform legislation. So that's a little bit up in the air right now. It's not likely to pass the Senate if they don't change Senate rules because they simply don't have the 60 votes needed. But that is definitely something that is being talked about and will likely continue to come up for the next several months. So moving on to the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, so the bipartisan infrastructure law. Of course, the bill was signed into law back in November. This is simply just a timeline on what that process looked like. So we've been working on this bill for many, many months now, all the way back to March of 2021, working with both House and Senate to include key provisions for counties. And so ultimately, now that the bill has been signed into law, the U.S. Department of Transportation and other federal agencies are working on implementation. So NACo is at the table with these federal agencies, making sure that they understand how the money flows specifically to states, as transportation funding often does, but making sure that counties have access to these critical funds. So taking a look at what is actually included in the infrastructure law. So what the bill does is that it invests $973 billion over 5 years. So all of that money is spanned over 5 years. It's not just a one-time allocation. Of that $973 billion, there's $550 billion for new investments in many, many different categories related to transportation and infrastructure. So as you can see on the screen, there is $284 billion for transportation, $73 billion for energy and power, $55 billion for water, $65 billion for broadband, and so on. So a lot of funding for many hundreds of projects. And then on this slide here, this simply just demonstrates how counties can actually access the funds. That's probably been one of the biggest questions that we have received after the bill was signed into law. So as you can see on the screen, there are really kind of 3 ways in which counties can access funds. So first is competitively. So it's through a federal grant program, a competitive federal grant program, and you ultimately have to go through a process that's run by the state departments of transportation, and you would apply for that grant. So that's one way. The second is sub-allocations that are based on populations from state departments of transportation. So many of the federal programs, as I mentioned earlier, they will allocate a portion of funding for whatever program it may be, and the county, not in a competitive way, but you could again apply to the state for funding, and they would sub-allocate that funding to your county, ultimately, of course, if you were approved, and the amount of funding that you receive is based on your county's population. And then the third one is all around federal formulas as well too. So formulas that were already part of these programs that have a predetermined funding level that your county would receive as well too. And then also, in addition to these 3 ways that you would be able to receive funds, is an additional $100 billion in competitive resources for state and local governments over 5 years. So that funding here, that's within Division J of the infrastructure law. What this is, it's very unique actually. So in addition to all of the federal funding that's going to all of those programs within the bill, there's a whole section that specifically focuses on advanced appropriations for state and local governments for transportation and infrastructure. So it's $100 billion over 5 years that's allocated to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and it's all via competitive grants. So counties would be able to apply directly to the Department of Transportation to receive this federal funding. So a lot is going on there. Again, very much so in implementation mode. I also do want to mention as well that NACo has a very, very good online resource, an analysis of the infrastructure law, where we actually outline every single program and whether counties are eligible to receive direct funding, either sub-allocation, competitive grants, etc. But urge you to check that out on our website. So then moving on to an overview of the U.S. Department of Treasury's final rule for the American Rescue Plan State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Just as a very quick refresher, so the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund was the $350 billion program that was authorized under the American Rescue Plan back in March of 2021. Of that $350 billion, $65.1 billion was allocated in direct and flexible funding to every single county, parish, borough across the country. So for the last several months, actually since May of 2021 until January 6th of 2022, we've been operating under Treasury's interim final rule that they released on May 10th of 2021. So now that they released the final rule, everything is set in stone in terms of eligible, ineligible uses of the funds. So I'm going to walk through some of the key new features of the final rule and differences between the final rule and the interim final rule. So these are just very key highlights before I get into the details of each section. So first and foremost is when does the final rule actually become effective? So Treasury outlines that the final rule is effective on April 1st of 2022. However, if your county would like to take advantage of the new provisions included in the final rule, because there is a lot more flexibility under the final rule, you can actually opt in and say that your county is adopting the final rule immediately. So you have that option. If you would like to continue to operate under the interim final rule, you can do that as well too. It is completely up to the county's discretion. Two, this goes back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, but under the final rule, under the revenue loss section, now counties are allowed to use up to $10 million of recovery funds and consider them as lost revenue for the provision of government services without having to calculate your revenue loss. So you do not have to use the Treasury formula anymore if you want to opt for that $10 million revenue loss standard allowance, which is what Treasury refers to it to. So you have that whole new option now, which is incredible. I'll go into detail about why it's so incredible on the next slide, but we were very, very happy to see that was included. Then also in regards to revenue loss is updates in the actual Treasury revenue loss formula. So now what you can do is that you can include utility revenue as well as liquor store sales. You previously were not allowed to include those revenue streams under the interim final rule. So you can now, you're not required, but you can. And then also in terms of the formula as well, in terms of improvements, what Treasury did is that they adjusted their annual average growth rate that they used for the formula. Previously, it was 4.1%. Now under the final rule, it's 5.2%. So moving on to capital expenditures. This was a huge question that we received from counties. So what the final rule does is that it clarifies eligible uses of recovery funds for capital expenditures. So like capital infrastructure projects. And it also outlines some of the requirements associated with certain projects that you invest in, depending on how much they cost. In terms of impacted and disproportionately impacted populations. You may remember under the final rule that you did, of course, have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you wanted to invest the funds, but specifically when you were investing in populations that were within qualified census tracts or QCTs, as they're called, you had the ability to provide an even broader range of services to these populations. You had more flexibility with what you were hoping to do with your dollars. So under the final rule, what Treasury does is that they just presume households, businesses, nonprofits were either impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And they outline what those definitions of impacted and disproportionately impacted are, as well as the services that you can provide or capital infrastructure projects, any sort of direct aid to the household, a very, very long list, but it's very helpful that the rule just presumes that these are impacted entities. Therefore, you can go about administering the funds quicker and reach more populations as well. For premium pay, new updates, it's just simply is that it streamlines the process better. You don't have to provide written justification for some employees. Also, the final rule does outline how you can actually administer the funds too. For rehiring local government staff, under the interim final rule, you were allowed to use recovery funds to hire to your pre-pandemic baseline. So whatever your workforce was on January 27th of 2020, Now what you can do under the final rule is not only to hire to pre-pandemic levels, but actually above your pre-pandemic levels. So you can hire up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline. For broadband infrastructure, so number 8 and 10, I'll put those two together actually. You can now, under the interim final rule, you are only allowed to use recovery funds, or excuse me, your revenue loss funds for the modernization of cybersecurity. Now what you can do under the final rule is use any traditional ARP dollars or your recovery fund dollars. So you can use any of your money for cybersecurity, including the modernization of hardware and software. And then also regarding broadband too, what Treasury did is that they took away a specific threshold for households and businesses that counties needed to target and support with their broadband infrastructure projects, ultimately to allow you to serve a broader population. And then finally, for the water and sewer projects, what the rule does is that it broadens eligible uses of your funds for these projects. Under the interim final rule, you were only allowed to invest in eligible projects under the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So the final rule just simply adds a couple of projects that are now eligible, including like culvert repair, dam and reservoir rehabilitation, a long list of lead remediation projects too. So going into some of the key highlights. So in terms of revenue loss. So as I mentioned, the key new features are the $10 million revenue loss allowance. So again, you can allocate up to $10 million to be spent on government services, and you do not have to do the revenue loss calculation. So that's one option. The second option is that you can still opt in to do the Treasury revenue loss formula, especially, for example, if your county had more than $10 million in revenue loss, right? You would probably still want to use the revenue loss formula. So you can also pick that as well too. That final bullet under the first key new feature is to demonstrate how big of a game changer this final rule is. So now under the final rule, 2,137 counties, which is 70% of the nation's counties, are now eligible to invest the entirety of their recovery fund allocation in government services. And so what that means is that it's just incredible flexibility for 70% of the nation's counties. And they have the discretion of how they want to use those funds, minus a few restrictions that I'll go into. The second key feature is the improvements to the revenue loss formula. As I mentioned, under the interim final rule, that 4.1% number, that was what was used in the revenue loss calculation formula. So because there's new data that came out, 2019 data specifically, Treasury updated that growth rate change to 5.2%. So you may remember when you were calculating your revenue loss, the first step was to look back at your county's last full 3 fiscal years prior to the pandemic, take that average revenue growth, and then compare it to the 4.1%, pick which percentage was bigger between the two. So now what you do, you still do the last 3 fiscal years, but now you compare it to that 5.2% growth rate, and pick whichever percentage is higher. So big change in that revenue loss formula. As I mentioned before, you can now include utility revenue and liquor store revenue. And then finally, under the interim final rule, counties were required to report what their revenue loss or recalculate what their revenue loss was on December 31st of 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. Because counties operate on different budget cycles and fiscal years, et cetera, we spoke to Treasury about this issue because under the interim final rule, it doesn't necessarily capture the reality of what the revenue loss is. So now your county has the option when you are calculating your revenue loss to either do it on a fiscal year or calendar year basis. But you do have to pick which one you want to do, and then you have to stay with that option throughout the entirety of the program. So until the program's done in December 31st of 2026. On this slide here, simply what I wanted to highlight was what are some of the common examples that Treasury used in terms of how you could use your revenue loss. But what I want to stress here is that, yes, while you have those examples such as construction of schools, hospitals, road building and maintenance, health services, and so on, purchasing of fire trucks and police vehicles. So yes, those are great examples, but I want to stress that Treasury does articulate government services include any service traditionally provided by a government. So do not limit yourself to those bullets that are on this screen. Really pay attention to the any service traditionally provided by a government. And then on the right side of the screen in the blue font is that these are the limitations around how you can use your revenue loss dollars. So you cannot use the revenue loss dollars for rainy day funds, debt service, or extraordinary pension contributions. So those are your limitations, and you can't use them for legal settlements as well. So key takeaways for revenue loss. Again, you now have the two options for determining revenue loss. You opt in for the $10 million ARP allocation standard allowance. I do want to note though, of course, if your county received less than $10 million, you received $8 million in your total allocation, you will only be able to claim $8 million for revenue loss. Your allocation amount won't go up. And then number two, second option, you can still calculate revenue loss with the Treasury formula with that new 5.2% default growth rate. And then that third bullet, and this is very important, is all around, you may remember submitting your interim reports that were due at the end of August. We know that many counties just simply said there was zero revenue loss in that report because you hadn't gotten around to doing the revenue loss calculation since it was a little bit confusing. So now with the first project and expenditure reports that are due either at the end of this month for larger counties, and then those that are due for smaller counties, April 30th of 2022, you can update this revenue loss number, and you will have to choose between electing for the $10 million standard allowance or doing your revenue loss calculation. So moving on to the public health and negative economic impacts sections. These are two different sections, but Treasury groups them together. So again, I'm just going to go through the key new features of each of these sections. So that first one, the enumerated eligible uses, that's really just a fancy way of Treasury saying they outlined pretty much everything that you could invest in, the recovery funds in. So what the final rule does is that it both expanded and clarified the following. So all categories, they provided a lot of clarification around those capital expenditures, as I mentioned. The impacted households, disproportionately impacted households, disproportionately impacted businesses. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the key highlights slide, but what it does is that it both defines what exactly an impacted household is. For example, it's a household that their annual income is below $65,000. Therefore, they're eligible for affordable housing, childcare, early learning services, and much, much more. Disproportionately impacted households. It's a household that does not currently make above $40,000 in annual income, and they have an even longer list of eligible services. So, community neighborhood revitalization activities, huge areas that you can invest in with your recovery funds. A lot of focus around equity-based services, addressing educational disparities, and so forth. And then the disproportionately impacted small businesses, again, it's all around defining what is impacted and disproportionately impacted businesses, and then being able to use the funds for rehabilitation of storefronts, investing in startups, helping with, providing loans or grants to businesses as well. And the same goes for nonprofits too. Also, this is within the negative economic impact section. So another key feature is clarity around aid to impacted industries. So first is that Treasury outlines how to actually designate an impacted industry. There are two options. So first, if it is the hospitality, travel, or tourism industry, Treasury just considers it impacted, therefore you can provide aid. That's the first option, just if they are hospitality, travel, or tourism. The second option, how to designate an impacted industry, is if the industry has experienced an 8% unemployment decline because of the pandemic, or if their negative economic impacts are comparable or worse than those faced by the travel, hospitality, and tourism industries. So those are the two. And then it also clarifies eligible uses that you can provide to impacted industries. So for example, you can only provide aid to industries that were operating pre-pandemic. You cannot provide aid to new industries. So a lot of clarity around eligible uses. Also, public sector capacity. I touched on this earlier. You're now allowed to rehire public sector staff to your pre-pandemic levels, or up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline. So again, your pre-pandemic baseline is however many full-time employees you had on January 27th of 2020. And if you do choose to rehire above pre-pandemic levels, Treasury does provide you with a formula for how you can, so you can know how many full-time employees you can hire. You also don't have to rehire staff in the same positions that you might have laid off during the pandemic. And then also you can use funds for other compensation in terms of using funds for staff retention. You can also use the funds to avoid any sort of layoffs or pay cuts. And then you can also provide funds for furloughed workers. So if you want to provide them with additional compensation as well. And then capital expenditures is a huge one. And I'll go into detail in this right now on this slide. So when we're talking about capital expenditures, so first and foremost, you have to make sure whatever capital improvement project or investment project that you're taking on, that it has to be related to public health or the negative economic impacts because of the pandemic. And it also has to be proportional to the pandemic. So it has to be equal to the negative economic impact, for example. What is consistent with the interim final rule and the final rule is that there's no pre-approval required or provided for capital expenditures. This means that you are responsible for reading the final rule, making sure that it's an eligible use and it complies with the final rule, and then you can go about spending the money. And then this is a new requirement by Treasury. So if you do want to spend your funds on a capital infrastructure project, you will be required to provide a written justification for a project that is either equal to or greater than $1 million. And so what that written justification includes is the description of harm or need to be addressed, or how the project will support the community. So for example, if you wanted to construct a affordable housing or permanent housing unit, how many people will it support? The second part of the written justification is an explanation of why the capital expenditure is appropriate. So why does your county's resources, why are they inadequate? And why do you actually need this capital expenditure to support the public health and negative economic impacts? And then 3 is the comparison of the proposed capital expenditure project against at least 2 alternative capital expenditures and why your proposed project is superior. So for example, if you wanted to expand on your hospital, why for social distancing, or expand on your jail for social distancing, why can't the same outcome be done with additional vaccinations, additional testing, and so forth? On this slide here it outlines all of the eligible capital expenditure projects and ineligible capital expenditure projects. What's important to note here, the eligible ones, you will not find a list of these in the final rule capital expenditures subsection. These are sprinkled throughout all the different sections within Treasury's final rule. So namely public health and negative economic impacts. But as you can see, very long list of all the capital expenditure projects that you can do now. The ineligible capital projects are construction of new correctional facilities, new congregate facilities, and then construction of convention centers, stadiums, or other larger capital projects intended for general economic development. That second one here, the reason why Treasury says that that's an ineligible use of funds is because they're very focused on addressing the negative economic impacts that happen because of COVID. And they're saying the general economic development isn't really useful to address those negative economic impacts. Moving on to the premium pay section. So key new features include, it still stays the same in terms of an additional $13 per hour on top of an individual's regular hourly rate. So that maintains the same. You can also provide up to $25,000 per person in premium pay. So what is new? Under the interim final rule, counties were required to submit a written justification to Treasury to ensure workers not listed could receive premium pay. Pretty much what the final rule does is that you don't have to submit that written justification. There are certain circumstances you still will need to, but it's presumed that they likely will be eligible to receive premium pay. And then also there's clarification on the types of premium pay. So how you can actually administer the funds. So you can provide it, as I mentioned, on an hourly basis. You can provide it in lump sums, installments. So you can provide an essential worker monthly, quarterly payments, however the county would like to do it. And then individuals, you can do hourly, part-time, salaried workers. And then the final rule clearly states volunteers cannot receive premium pay. Something that does carry over from the interim final rule on premium pay is that the person that's receiving premium pay has to be both an essential worker and they have to be performing essential work. So again, essential work is defined as regular in-person interactions or physical handling of items. So if a person is teleworking, doing work from the home, they are not eligible for premium pay. So the second to last section here is water and sewer infrastructure. So key new features, again, under the interim final rule, you are only allowed to invest in eligible projects under the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. The final rule provides additional eligible projects. So just a few that are outlined here, a broader set of lead remediation projects, culvert repair, residential wells, certain dams and reservoirs, and really any sort of project that ensures access to safe drinking water. And then broadband infrastructure. Again, it broadens eligible broadband infrastructure investments to better to provide better connectivity for residents. So under the interim final rule, counties were required to target households that did not have a reliable wireline of 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. Treasury got completely rid of that language under the final rule. So simply what you need to do is invest in locations that don't have a reliable wireline of 100 megabits download speed and 20 megabits upload speed. So again, it really broadens the populations that you can serve under the final rule. The final rule does require counties to invest in broadband infrastructure projects that do provide 100 megabits download speed, 100 megabits upload speed, but there is some flexibility around that. Namely, you do have flexibility if you have a project that provides anywhere between 100 megabits download speed and 20 to 100 megabits upload speed. That will likely still be an eligible use. They say you have this flexibility if there's excessive costs associated with the project or due to like geographic location as well too. And then finally, the ineligible expenses, very simple for the most part here. Everything is pretty much carried through from the interim final rule. Pension funds, again, you cannot use recovery funds for extraordinary contributions to pension funds. Other restrictions include you can't use any of the funds for debt service, legal settlements or judgments, deposits to rainy day funds or financial reserves. And then also the final rule does clarify that you cannot use the funds that undermine COVID-19 mitigation practices that are in line with the CDC guidance, or that would violate uniform guidance conflict of interest requirements and other laws. That uniform guidance, there's more information about all of those requirements under Treasury's compliance and reporting requirements documents that they've come out with too. So that is the final rule in a nutshell, along with some of our top priorities throughout the next several months. I am more than happy to take any questions, but Mike, I will turn it back over to you. But thank you again to the group for inviting me to be here today.
Erin, terrific. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions out there, and folks, to the extent that you're now digesting the information, take some time and drop any additional questions into the chat box. We'll start out with one question. Goes back to a little bit earlier in your presentation. Would roads and street repair be included in the infrastructure? This would be for smaller municipalities.
Sorry about that. So in terms of street and road repair, there is specifically funding for bridges, roadways, highways, you name it. On that analysis that I mentioned, we also do have a breakdown of all of the transportation and infrastructure funding, but that was a key provision. I think there is funding, the number I think is 273 billion specifically for roads, bridges, and highway repair, improvement, new construction. So there are definitely programs that are targeting those types of projects. And again, on our analysis, I can actually put it in here as well too. You can also see all of the funding that you're eligible for. I do also want to note as well too, we are updating this analysis as well, where we are working on a chart that outlines, I think it's about 90 programs within the bipartisan infrastructure law that counties are eligible to receive direct funding for, and how you access that funding as well too. So we're hoping to get that up online by the end of this week as well.
Terrific. And again, for folks attending, Erin has dropped the web link into the chat, so be sure to copy that as a resource. It'll also be available in the materials that we send out after the presentation. Next question, can recreation projects such as trails be funded even in communities that are not qualified as diverse or low income?
So if you use your revenue loss money, definitely, either electing up to the $10 million or using the calculation, you can definitely do that. And then for parks and recreation, that is outlined as an eligible use because again, it's the wear and tear, more people are going outside because of the pandemic. So you can use the recovery funds in that way.
That's good to hear. Nice to hear that. Well, generally, it sounds like the approach is broadened to make to really give the communities more flexibility to pursue some of their long sought after projects. General question here, for Illinois municipalities, are the rules essentially the same as for county governments?
Yes, yeah. They are the same. Everyone's operating under the final rule. The only differences I would note for the municipalities is around the reporting requirements, especially if you're a non-entitlement unit, an NEU, which only pertains to cities. There are no counties that are NEUs, but you do have a little bit different reporting requirements from Treasury as well. You do not have to worry about that for the end of this month when the projects and expenditures reports are due for counties that have populations of 250,000 and above or received more than $10 million in total ARP awards. So I would just note, again, the reporting requirements are a little bit different for some municipalities, especially smaller.
And the details of those differential requirements, you just have to read from the rules and regs from the fine print.
Yes, and I'll put that actually in the chat right here. So the link that I just put in the chat, those are the compliance and reporting guidance that Treasury released. So it goes into detail of non-entitlement units, what's required of you as well.
Good, thank you. All right, next question. So for the new changes to loss revenue, if a county received less than 10 million, can they use all of their ARPA funds for the loss revenue up to 10 million?
So if your county received, yes, if you received less than 10 million and you wanted to elect for the 10 million standard allowance, you could use all of your funds for lost revenue on any sort of government services. But as I mentioned earlier, if you receive $7 million in total ARP allocations, if you choose to elect for that $10 million ARP standard allowance, you're still only going to have 7 million. It doesn't change the allocation that you receive, but you can use all of your funds towards revenue loss.
Somebody notes that an early slide indicated 10 million or 30% for lost revenue, but subsequent slides only indicated 10 million. Question is, which is it?
So that in response to Dave's question, I believe, so we're talking about two different things now. So the first thing in Treasury's rule, it's $10 million for lost revenue. You can consider $10 million for lost revenue now. Under the interim final rule, you could not. You could only use the revenue loss formula. So that's one that is set in stone. That is law. Operate under the final rule in that way. The 30% item that I mentioned, that's going back to that ARP flexibility legislation that I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation. The bill number is HR 5735. So included in that bill, it did have that $10 million ARP revenue loss provision, but we still care about that, but we don't care about that right now. The 30% provision, that's another provision included in the HR 5735. So in that bill that we're still pushing for, if enacted, counties would also have the ability to allocate up to either $10 million or 30% of their ARP allocation, whichever is greater, 10 million or 30%, towards transportation and infrastructure projects or community development block grant projects. So these are two different items that we're talking about. But the 30%, 10 million for transportation and infrastructure, that's included in HR 5735. That is still in the House, and the House hasn't voted on yet.
Yeah, a lot of different tracks to keep track of. Nancy notes, thank you for these links. There are a lot of resource sites out there that have yet to update the information in regards to the final rule updates. Can you refer us to a few up-to-date sources for this information? Providing those now or later to be mailed out would be appreciated. And we can drop those, we can make those sources of information available in the information that we deliver to
Definitely.
our constituents, unless you want to mention some of them now.
I think really for right now, the two resources that I just put into the chat, both NACo's analysis of the infrastructure package as well as our analysis on the Treasury final rule, are really good. I also would say we do have several recordings that we've done. If you go to NACo's events page, and I can put those in the chat as well too, but they're webinar recordings that provide a really very in-depth overview of the final rule that we did last week. Yesterday we did our first information session series where we did a deep dive into the revenue loss provision of the final rule. We're doing one on broadband infrastructure as well too, and you can register. You can actually register for that. I'll put that in as well. But I'll put a whole list of resources that you all can share as well.
Terrific. I think folks will be appreciative of those kinds of information sources. Cassidy asks, is there any guidance for cities, towns, and counties about collaborating for the use of the funds?
So great question. So in terms of collaborating and using funds, so the final rule does articulate that cities and counties can pull together their resources and fund like regional projects, anything that helps, that benefits your your shared constituents. So you can do that. That's an eligible use. In terms of best practices, NACo does have an ARP investment database where we've collected around a little over 200 ARP plans that outline some of those relationships and partnerships between cities and counties. I'll also put that in the chat as well too. But also the National League of Cities, they have some examples as well. NACo and NLC are working together on a joint report to actually highlight examples as well.
Outstanding. When will the reporting requirements for the April deadline be available in the portal? I haven't seen anything on how that will look with new changes.
So Treasury has actually not released the reporting for the counties or cities that have to submit their first project and expenditures report on April 30th of 2021. They did not provide a timeline. I'm just going to throw it out there and assume, but I really don't know that if Treasury did release the project and expenditures reports for the ones that are due at the end of this month, they released them on January 7th. I would say maybe a similar timeline for those that are due on the April 30th. Again, Treasury did not release a timeline, but I'm just kind of inferring with what the timeline looked like for these ones that are due.
So basically just keep watching things and okay. We're nearing the end of our time and we opened up a poll. Be delighted if you'd take just a second to respond and let us know what you've thought of the material so far. Appreciate that. We've got time for a couple more questions. One question, does NACo have any maps, for example, generated with ESRI data with counties and success stories?
So NACo is working with ESRI right now, actually on this. So that is in the pipeline. I am also posting in the chat around the kind of success stories piece. I am posting in the chat right now. This is a link to our ARP Recovery Fund investment database. So what you can actually do, and we also have a series of briefs around how counties are investing recovery funds into, to support children and families towards equity, housing, and homelessness. But if you go down more in the page, down the webpage a little bit more, you can actually filter by topic area. So for example, if you are interested in seeing how counties are investing in broadband infrastructure, you can actually type in broadband infrastructure into that drop-down menu, and it will pop up every single plan that has any sort of broadband related to it. So I do urge you to go on that site as well. Really, really great way to share best practices. If your county is already, started using the funds and you don't see yourselves on there, please just let us know. We would love to add you as well too.
Okay. Someone has made a quick note that a link led to a page not found link. We'll try to correct those links, and they'll be part of the information that goes out after the program. Another question, we've got time for just a couple more. If we claim the 10 million in revenue loss, can we then put the money to any project we want?
Yes, you can. So long that it does not, you still cannot use the revenue loss funds, for, you can't use the funds for rainy day or reserve funds. You can't use them for debt service. You can't commingle with debt service either. You can't use them for legal settlements or judgments. And you can't use them in any way if it undermines the COVID-19 mitigation strategies put forth by CDC. And then also if they violate the uniform guidance, which is the also kind of like reporting requirements as well that you have to follow. But all in all, any sort of government service that your county would traditionally provide, you can use the revenue loss funds for that.
And those restrictions were nicely summarized in your slide deck, so folks can use the slide deck as a reference tool. And I imagine the same information is on the website.
Yes, the same, on our analysis, correct.
Another question, we are a municipality. I'm completing the compliance 1231 reporting, and the revenue loss is not updated for fiscal instead of calendar year. And 4.1% is still the percentage in the information for the average annual growth rate instead of 5.2. Should I complete based on the new options of fiscal year and percentage?
So that is actually, that is something that we sent a question to Treasury yesterday to see if they're going to update it or kind of what's happening.
Okay, so answer there is to be continued. All right, looks like we've got some of the corrected links there. One very useful general destination would be member.naco.org/webinars, and also a NACo link on events, U.S. Treasury's final rule, ARPA Fiscal Recovery Fund broadband. Any final questions as we come up to the end of our time together this morning? Give folks just a second. Eryn, I'll take this opportunity to close things out. On behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, thank you so much for your very informative and timely presentation. I mean, it doesn't get much more current than this. As I mentioned earlier to our participants today, if you've registered for the webinar, you will automatically receive the presentation materials and a link to the recording in a follow-up email. Most of you have noted if you didn't register and are participating today, you've dropped your email into the chat box and you'll be put on the list for receipt of those materials. I'd also like to invite you to visit our website, the Illinois Extension Community and Economic Development, to register for future webinars. Visit go.illinois.edu/LGE. For example, next week on Monday, January 24th, a lot of you will already know this, again at 11 a.m., we're offering a matching presentation on state legislative updates. And you can use the same resource, I'd note, to find recordings, as I mentioned at the start of the program, of a host of prior presentations on a wide variety of topics. Okay, we'd like to thank all of you as well for attending today's webinar. We hope you have a great day, and we genuinely hope that we get to see you back here for future presentation. So thank you so much.